blue, brown, blue, brown, blue, brown, blue, brown, blue, brown, brown. Since the game's release, the Blue Scout has had brown pants, even though there's an existing pattern with the classes to have team-colored pants. But the Scout could just be an exception, right? In Meet the Spy, he has the brown pants. The Robot Scout has brown pants too. But that's about it. It's actually almost assuredly a mistake. In concept art, he has blue pants. Orange Box trailer, blue pants. Promotional pre-release gameplay screenshots, blue pants. In the 2011 Smith comic, it's blue. In the 2012 MVM Update comic, it's blue. On the in-game portraits, it's blue. And most of all, on the PS3 version of TF2, the Scout has his blue pants. Even in the current version of TF2, the belt loops change color, clashing against the pants, which is probably the clearest expression of their intent on this. And now, with the recent leak, we have an idea of how this mistake happened. In the Photoshop file, every single bit of team color is on this one layer, and same for red. Except the pants. The blue pants were separated into its own layer, so presumably, when exporting the textures, they forgot to turn on the blue pants as well. Scout's red and blue textures seemingly share the same Photoshop file, whereas the other classes have a Photoshop file per team color, so that probably made it worse.
LND, with the end, or near the end of Moore's Law, how do you expect to see continued generational performance improvement as the transistors can no longer shrink?
You know, it seems impossible, but they keep doing it.
Yeah, they keep finding some lever to turn, some wheel to crank.
Yeah.
IPC improvements.
Yeah.
Like there's things
Well,
that...
3D stacking
looks
like it is going
That's
to
a
be
fun one.
huge. Chiplets look like they are going to be huge.
You might find other ways to expand the amount that you're using, not necessarily the amount we can fit in a certain area.
Like, okay, technology like in Intel's Foveros chip, where they've got, I forget, it's like 3 or 4 different manufacturing processes and all these buses that are communicating with each other on this like giant package. Stuff like that is going to make its way to consumer technology or to consumer electronics at some point, and could be a game changer. I mean, the way that AI is changing the game too is massive. I think that we are super mad about NVIDIA giving us underpowered gaming chips at a price that isn't palatable right now. But when we look back, so 10 years from now, when we're playing photorealistic games at 300 frames per second or whatever, on chips that fundamentally haven't changed nearly as much as the 10 years prior, we're going to be looking at it going, wow, they were way ahead. And that was early teething pain for what was ultimately going to be the future. I mean, just looking at the way that, I was looking at this new Photoshop feature where you basically just give it an image and then just tell it like, oh yeah, I want a lake in the middle, and I want a car, and I want a cloud that's shaped like the car. You saw the same article I did.
Yeah, I meant to send it to our thumbnail designer, but I forgot. Yeah, I'm sure they're already.
So Photoshop just has generative AI built in, and if we're doing that in Photoshop now, then give it a little bit more time, and we'll be doing that in real time in games. You'll be able to mod a game by simply typing in a prompt. Okay, I want to play Super Mario World, but all of the Koopas are
procedurally generated games are going to be a whole
little
new
faces with mustaches.
Ball of wax. Like that's insane. I don't think I've even thought about that before.
Yeah,
procedurally generated games don't have to pre-make the assets.
Yeah, like, it's just like I want to play Half-Life 2, but all the opponents are donkeys, and you know what? It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to get pretty good.
You can hugely simplify the modding scene for certain things. You know when they made all the dragons in Skyrim into Thomas the Tank Engine or whatever?
I didn't see that, but I love it.
It's a fantastic mod. They even, when they fly in, you normally hear the dragon roar. They have a train horn. It's very good. It's very good. But you could do stuff like that using this instead. Oh, did you find it?
Do you want sound?
No, I don't think sound will be necessary entirely.
So it's going to land on top of the tower that you're looking at right now. Oh, come on, it's Skyrim.
Yeah.
You see it flying around in the background? It's going to slam down. There's people who would they'd be like arachnophobic or whatever, so they would replace all the spiders in the game with like teddy bears or whatever else too.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that sort of thing is only going to get easier.
Oh, so good.
Which is great.
Yeah. Oh man. You know what would be really interesting? Oh man. I wonder if we'll get to the point. You know how we've been waiting for, or I have, whatever, for Skyblivion and Moreblivion, or more Skywind. Sorry, there we go. Which are it's Morrowind and Oblivion rebuilt in Skyrim's engine, with really high resolution textures and all that kind of stuff. Because you can do some pretty cool things in Skyrim's engine, even though it's pretty old. I think we're going to get to a certain point eventually where because it's going to have some issues doing this kind of stuff out of nowhere, creativity problems, all that kind of stuff, it pulls from something, whatever. But you might be able to go like, okay, here's a game. Here's all the information I have, all the local files, all that kind of stuff. I want you to recreate this using UE5 or whatever. I want you to recreate this using this other thing.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Because it's pretty good at like translating, right?
Even stuff like RTX Remix. Just AI replace all the light sources with real point light sources. And then you'll have to go in and tweak it. You'll still have to be a graphic designer or a game designer or whatever else.
Work.
But man,
yeah, it's like the generative AI in Photoshop, right? It's not replacing artists.
Yeah, we still need an artist to do that.
I mean, all the same people do all the same stuff. It just makes their job easier.
Well, more realistically, it makes it so they have to do more of it. But
yeah, because that's what working here is like. There's always going to be stuff to do. That is never a concern.
I mean, that's what work is like, Luke.
Yeah.
I don't make a freaking. I was reading I was reading an article. They surveyed.
I in a bad way.
They surveyed a bunch of Gen Z and millennial people who have sort of pioneered this concept of it's called lying flat in China or quiet quitting in North America. Of their top priorities being work-life balance as opposed to all these other things. And then when they continue asking them questions, they're like, okay, right, but is that a thing? And they're like, no. No, actually, I have a second job hustling because.
You get bored.
Well, no, it's just inflation's out of control.
Okay.
It's not actually feasible.
Yeah.
Like you have to bust your butt. Realistically, it makes it so they have to do more of it. But
yeah, because that's what working here is like. There's always going to be stuff to do. That is never a concern.
I mean, that's what work is like, Luke.
Yeah.
I don't make the freaking. I was reading I was reading an article. They surveyed.
I'm saying that in a bad way.
They surveyed a bunch of Gen Z and millennial people who have sort of pioneered this concept of, it's called lying flat in China or quiet quitting in North America, of, you know, their top priorities being, you know, work-life balance as opposed to all these other things. And then when they continue asking them questions, they're like, okay, right, but is that a thing? And they're like, no. No, actually, I have a second job hustling because
you get bored.
well, no, it's just inflation's out of control.
Okay.
Like it's not actually feasible.
Yeah.
Like you have to bust your butt, and so it's this sort of aspirational thing. I don't know. It's a big challenge. It's one of those things where I feel like we do, I think, a pretty good job of trying to make it so that people don't have to work outside their 40 hours. But
tough right now.
By and large, the way the world's going right now, it's not like that. It has shifted from an employee's market to an employer's market. Like looking at what's going on with the big tech firms and the way that they're bringing everyone back to office, cutting perks, laying off literally thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of staff.
I watched a video recently of a certain excessively rich person, and it was like,
how much is a banana? Something else.
That one was really funny.
That was really funny.
Very funny. But no, they were like, okay, if we take this person's net wealth in single American dollar bills, so like $1 US, because I know a lot of other countries don't have that, so make sure you know, and we stacked it like horizontally and try to wrap around the world.
Yeah.
How far do we get? Single US dollar bills.
Like the width.
Almost, yeah, pressed against each other.
Right.
You almost make it the whole way around the world.
Wow.
It's just like, does this make any sense? Like, I don't know. Anyways, sorry. We'll get back on the tech topics.
Japanese folktales, you may come across stories about an old practice that seems pretty crazy. These stories had a million versions and were told so widely that historians had to ask, did they really carry out this practice? One story goes like this. In a poor village in the mountains, there lived a man and his 60-year-old mother. One day, the mother told her son that it was time to take her up the mountain. You see, this village had a custom that people who turned 60 had to be taken deep into the mountain forest and left there. Old people ate precious food, but it didn't contribute to the community. Tough times call for tough crimes. The man refused, but his mother insisted. She didn't want to be a burden. After some time, the man sadly agreed, and he carried her into the mountain forest. As they were walking, he noticed that his mother was breaking off twigs from tree branches along the way and dropping them on the ground. He asked what she was doing, and she said she was leaving marks on the ground so that he would not get lost on the way home. A love tsunami of affection and gratitude washed over the man, and he turned around. He took her home and vowed to take care of his mother from then on. One day, a lord came to the village and gave the villagers a task, a puzzle. He told them to make a rope out of ash for him. People tried and tried, but it was impossible. How could you tie ash into a rope? The man went home and mentioned it to his mother. She was like, oh, piece of cake, and told him to wet some straw with salty water and make a rope with it. After drying it, burn it to ashes. It would keep the shape of the rope. The man thought, wow, mommy is so smart. And he did as she said. The lord was impressed and asked if the man thought of this himself. That was when he admitted that he did not abandon his mother and that the ash rope was her idea. The lord thought about this, then declared that people should no longer abandon their elderly parents. Although old people couldn't contribute much physically, they made up for it with their wisdom. In a different version of the story, a man carried his old father up in a basket, and the man's young son tagged along. After the man dropped off his father, the young son said, we should take the basket back so that I can carry you when you get old. The man said, son of a bitch, and carried his elderly father back down. The mountain was called Obasteyama, the mountain of abandoned old women. According to legend, this mountain still exists today. Stories like this passed from the mouths of so many people that historians put down the wine, pulled a few graduate students from the closet, and got to work. They wanted to answer the question, did Obaste, the practice of abandoning old women, actually exist in Japan? There were some stories of people abandoning their fathers, but most stories had a son getting rid of his mother for some reason. Killing the elderly to benefit the community was something documented in a few cultures in history, but those unlucky wankers usually lived in harsh environments where eating was something you only did on holidays. Japan's natural environment, however, consists of Pokemon and anime girls, plenty of things to eat. Not normally a society where mommy gets cut because the family's running low on tofu. When historians looked at this question, they looked at it more broadly, not just whether people left their mothers in the mountains. Taking mom on a one-way walk in the woods is pretty dramatic and traumatizing for everyone. Sorry, Mika, grandma's gone. She's up above now, watching over us. She's in heaven? No, she's on the mountain, watching us because she's hungry. But there were more straightforward ways to get rid of someone, like starving them or just neglecting them. The tales suggested that people might have seen old women as burdens, and their families might have neglected or mistreated them. But wait, the old stories didn't say that only burdensome old women had to be taken up the mountain. They said all old women. What about the women who were successful and had positions of power? Why kill them? That would have harmed the community. The burdensome mother argument didn't really make sense. So some historians said, well, maybe it was something else, like competition between women in the household. The argument goes like this. An old mother typically runs the household, and it's nice being the boss. You're important, you feel needed, and you have a lot to do. But when your son gets married and brings home an ungrateful little hoe-in-law who wants to take your position and is always fighting you, you might just have a heart attack. As the daughter-in-law takes over the role of household manager, it increases the mother's stress and lowers her status, happiness, and maybe even access to food and money, causing the mother to die sooner. That's the argument. It kind of makes sense. Historically, the people in a family most likely to fight were daughter-in-law and mother-in-law. The daughter-in-law always trying to take power, the mother-in-law always trying to get this low bitch to follow the ways of the household. The dishwasher is for drying dishes only. It was a study that looked at families from the Edo and Meiji periods to see if the evidence supported the dangerous daughter-in-law argument. It looked at women who were 60 years old to see how long they lived for, depending on what was happening at home. Yeah, the study marked old age at 60. Some people may disagree. I know you guys don't all think 60 is too old. I've seen the websites you visit. If the argument is correct, then we'd expect to see old women who lived with a daughter-in-law die earlier than women who did not live with a daughter-in-law. And when researchers looked at the data, they did not see that. They saw the opposite. Women who lived with a daughter-in-law survived a bit longer than women who did not. That's a -1 for the argument. Then they looked closer at the ages of the two women and found that if both women were closer in age, mother-in-laws tended to die sooner. Women who had a young daughter-in-law lived on average 25 years after 60, but women who had an older daughter-in-law lived only 16 years after 60. What's happening there? Well, women closer in age had similar goals, and they were more likely to fight for similar things like control of the household. Choosing an older wife for your son was a health hazard. This seemed to support the dangerous daughter-in-law argument, but the researchers concluded that since most mothers were more than 30 years older than their daughters-in-law, it didn't have a big effect. Researchers also looked at grandchildren. Did they kill their grandmothers? A new daughter-in-law didn't have much power in the household until she popped out a few kids and gained massive clout. Bebes are excellent for promotions, and that promotion might have threatened the mother-in-law's authority. So women who had grandchildren in the home might have died sooner. After digging into it, researchers again discovered the opposite. Man, these predictions were pretty shit. Women with grandchildren lived way longer than women without, about 3 times longer after 60. This is why your parents want grandchildren. It's a matter of life and death. Be a good son or daughter and stop murdering your parents. Why were grandchildren the key to long life? It could have been that having an important job like caring for a grandchild gave women purpose and happiness. Or it could have been the households that were more well-off produced grandchildren. It meant a couple was able to have kids, the kids grew up and married, and marriage produced more kids, all without them dying. Back then, kids were like crypto investors. They often didn't make it. So a household that passed all those hurdles was probably doing well financially. It made sense that people lived longer in those households. From the data, it looks like the daughter-in-law wasn't responsible for the death of her mother-in-law. So what was responsible? They found that the women who lived the longest, into their 80s and even 90s, were married women who lived with a young daughter-in-law and had grandchildren. The next group was the largest group, who lived into their late 70s and early 80s. They were married women as